Road to Unfreedom, Chapter 1, Individualism or Totalitarianism, 2011. With law our land shall rise, but it will perish with lawlessness. He who can make an exception is sovereign. Carl Schmitt, 1922. The politics of inevitability is the idea that there is no ideas. Those in it, Thrall, deny ideas matter, proving only that they are in the grip of a powerful one. The cliché of politics of inevitability is that there are no alternatives. To accept this is to deny individual responsibility for seeing history and making change. Life becomes a sleepwalk to a pre-made grave in a pre-purchased plot. Eternity arises from inevitability, like a ghost from a corpse. The capitalist version of politics of inevitability, the market as a substitute for policy, generates economic inequality that undermines belief in progress. As social mobility halts, inevitability gives way to eternity. Democracy gives way to oligarchy. An oligarch, spinning a tale of an innocent past, perhaps with the help of fascist ideas, offers fake protection to people with real pain. Faith that technology serves freedom often opens the way to his spectacle. As distraction replaces concentration, the future dissolves into frustrations of the present and eternity becomes daily life. The oligarch crosses into real politics from a world of fiction and governs by evoking myth and manufactured crisis. In the 2010s, one such person, Vladimir Putin, escorted another, Donald Trump, from fiction to power. Russia reaches the politics of eternity first. Russian leaders protecting themselves and their wealth by exploiting it. The oligarch-in-chief, Vladimir Putin, chose the fascist philosopher Ivan Ilyin as a guide. The poet Czesław Miłosz wrote in 1953, "Only in the middle of the 20th century did the inhabitants of many European countries come to the understanding, usually by way of suffering, that complex and difficult philosophy books have a distinct influence on their faith. Some of the philosophy books that matter today were written by Ilyin, who died the year after Miłosz wrote those lines." Ivan Ilyin's revival by official Russia in the 1990s and the 2000s has given his work a second life as fascism adapted to make oligarchy possible, as the specific ideas that have helped leaders shift from inevitability to eternity. The fascism of 1920s and 1930s, Ilyin's era, the three core features. It celebrated will and violence over reason and law. It proposed a leader with a mythical connection to his people, and its characterization of globalization as a conspiracy rather than a set of problems. Revived today, in conditions of inequality as politics of eternity, fascism serves oligarchs as a catalyst for transition away from public discussion and towards political fiction, away from meaningful voting and towards fake democracy, away from rule of law and towards personalist regimes. History always continues, and alternatives always present themselves. Ilyin represented one of those. He is not the only fascist thinker to have been revived in our country, but he is the most important. He is a guide on the darkening road to unfreedom, which leads from inevitability to eternity. Learning of his ideas and influence, we can look down the road, seeking light and exits. This means thinking historically, asking how ideas from the past can matter in the present, comparing Ilyin's ideas of globalization to our own, realizing that, then as now, the possibilities were real and more than two. The natural successor of the veil of inevitability is the shroud of eternity. But there are alternatives that must be found before the shroud drops. If we accept eternity, we sacrifice individuality, and we no longer see possibility. Eternity is another idea that says that there are no ideas. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, American politicians of inevitability proclaimed the end of history, while some Russians sought new authorities in an imperial past. When founded in 1922, the Soviet Union inherited most of the territory of the Russian Empire. The Tsarists' domain had been the largest in the world, stretching west to east from the middle of Europe to the shores of the Pacific and north to south from the Arctic to Central Asia. Though largely a country of peasants and nomads, Russia's middle class and intellectuals considered, as the 20th century began, how an empire ruled by aristocrats might become more modern and more just. Ivan Ilyin, born to a noble family in 1883, was typical of his generation as a young man. In the early 1900s, he wanted Russia to become a state governed by laws. After the disastrous First World War and his experience of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, Ilyin became a counter-revolutionary, an advocate for violent methods against revolution, and with time, the author of a Christian fascism meant to overcome Bolshevism. In 1922, a few months before the Soviet Union's founding, he was exiled from his homeland. Writing in Berlin, he offered a program to the opponents of the new Soviet Union, known as the Whites. These were the men who fought against the Bolshevik Red Army in the long and bloody Russian Civil War, and then made their way, like Ilyin, into political emigration in Europe. Ilyin later formulated his writings as the governance for Russia's leaders who would come to power after the end of the Soviet Union. He died in 1954. After a new Russian Federation emerged in the defunct Soviet Union in 1991, Ilyin's short book, Our Tasks, began to circulate in a new Russian edition. His collected works were published, and his ideas gained powerful supporters. He had died forgotten in Switzerland. Putin organized a reburial in Moscow in 2005. Ilyin's personal papers had found their way to Michigan State University. Putin sent an emissary to reclaim them in 2006. By then, Putin was citing Ilyin in his annual presidential address to the General Assembly of the Russian Parliament. These were important speeches, composed by Putin himself. In the 2010s, Putin relied upon Ilyin's authority to explain why Russia had to undermine the European Union and invade Ukraine. When asked to name a historian, Putin cited Ilyin as his authority on the past. The Russian political class followed Putin's example. His propaganda master, Vladislav Suvkov, adapted Ilyin's ideas to the world of modern media. Suvkov orchestrated Putin's rise to power and oversaw the consolidation of media that ensured Putin's seemingly eternal rule. Dmitry Medvedev, the former head of the political party, recommended Ilyin to the Russian youth. Ilyin's name was on the lips of leaders of the fake opposition party, the Communist and the far-right Liberal Democrats, who played a part in creating simulacrum of democracy that Ilyin had recommended. Ilyin was cited by the heads of the Constitutional Court, and even his ideas that law meant love for a leader's ascension. He was mentioned by the Russian regional governors as Russia became the central state that he had advocated. In early 2014, members of the Russian ruling party and all the Russian civil servants received a collection of Ilyin's political publications from the Kremlin. In 2017, Russian television commemorated the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution with a film that presented Ilyin as a moral authority. Ilyin was a politician of eternity. His thoughts held sway as the capitalist version of the politics of inevitability collapsed in Russia of the 1990s and 2000s. As Russia became a organized kleptocracy in the 2010s, as democratic inequalities reached stupefied proportions, Ilyin's influence peaked. Russia's assault on the European Union and the United States revealed, by targeting them, certain political virtues that Ilyin, the philosopher, ignored or despised: individualism, succession, integration, novelty, truth, equality. Ilyin first proposed his ideas to Russians a century ago, after the Russian Revolution, and yet he became a philosopher for our time. No thinker of the 20th century had been rehabilitated in such a grand style in the 21st century, nor enjoyed such influence in the world politics. If this went unnoticed, it was because we are in the thrall of inevitability. We believe that the ideas do not matter. To think historically is to accept that the unfamiliar might be significant, and to work to make the unfamiliar the familiar. Our politics of inevitability echoes those of Ilyin's years, like the period of the 1980s or the early 2010s. So the period from the late 1880s to the early 1910s was one of globalization. The conventional wisdom of both eras held that export-led growth would bring enlightened politics and end fascism. This optimism broke during the First World War and the revolutions and counter-revolutions that followed. Ilyin was himself an early example of this trend. A youthful supporter of the rule of law, he shifted to the extreme right while admiring tactics he had observed on the extreme left. The former left, Benito Mussolini, led his fascism in the March on Rome soon after Ilyin was expelled from Russia. The philosopher saw in the Jews hope for a corrupt world. Ilyin regarded fascism as the politics of the world to come. In the exile of the 1920s, he was troubled that the Italians arrived at fascism before Russia. He consoled himself with the idea that Russian whites were the inspiration for Mussolini's coup. The white movement, as such, is deeper and broader than the Italian fascism. The depth and breadth, Ilyin explained, came from the embrace of the sort of Christianity that demanded the blood sacrifice of God's enemies. Believing that in the 1920s, Russian whites exiled could still win power, Ilyin addressed them as "my white brothers, fascists." Ilyin was similarly impressed by Adolf Hitler. Although he visited Italy and vacationed in Switzerland, Ilyin's home between 1922 and 1938 was Berlin, where he worked for a government-sponsored scholarly institute. Ilyin's mother was German. He undertook psychoanalysis with Sigmund Freud in Germany. He studied German philosophy, and he wrote in German as well, and as often as he did in Russian. In his day job, he edited and wrote critical studies of Soviet politics, A World of the Abyss in German, and The Poison of Bolshevism in Russian, for example, just in the year 1931. Ilyin saw Hitler as a defender of civilization from Bolshevism. The Führer, he wrote, had, quote, performed an enormous service for all of Europe, end quote, by preventing further revolutions on the Russian model. Ilyin noted that with approval that Hitler's anti-Semitism was derived ideology of Russian whites. He bemoaned that, quote, Europe did not understand that the National Socialist movement, end quote. Nazism was above all, quote, spirit, end quote, of which Russians must partake. In 1938, Ilyin left Germany for Switzerland, where he lived until his death in 1954. He was supported financially by the wife of a German-American businessman, who also earned some money by giving public lectures in Germany. The essence of these lectures, as a scholar noted, was that Russia should be understood not as present communist danger, but as a future Christian salvation. According to Ilyin, communism had been inflicted upon innocent Russians by the decadent West. One day, Russia would liberate itself and others with the help of the Christian fascism. A Swiss reviewer characterized his book as, quote, nationalism in the sense of opposing the entire West, end quote. Ilyin's political views did not change as the Second World War began. His contacts in Switzerland were men of the far right. Rudolf Grubb believed that Switzerland should imitate Nazi Germany. Theophilip Sporee belonged to a group that banned Jews and Masons. Albert Reidweg was a right-wing lawyer whose brother Franz was the most prominent Swiss citizen in the Nazi extermination apparatus. Franz Reidweg married the daughter of a German minister of war and joined the Nazis' SS. He took part in the German invasion of Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, the last of which Ilyin saw as a trial of Bolshevism in which Nazis might liberate Russia. When the Soviet Union won the war and extended its empire westward in 1945, Ilyin began to write for future generations of Russians. He characterized his work as shining a small lantern in a great darkness. With the small flame, Russian leaders of the 2010s have begun a conflagration. Ilyin was consistent. His first major work of philosophy, in Russian in 1916, was also his last major work of philosophy, in its edited German translation, 1946. The one good in the universe, Ilyin maintained, had been God's totality before creation. When God created the world, he shattered the single and total truth that was himself. Ilyin divided the world into the categorical, the lost realm of the single perfect concept, and the, quote, historical, end quote, human life with its facts and passion. For him, the tragedy of existence was the facts that could not be reassembled into God's totality, nor passion into God's purpose. The Romanian thinker E.M. Coiran, himself once an advocate of a Christian fascism, explained the concept. Before history, God is perfect and eternal. Once he began history, God seems frenetic and committing errors upon error, as Ilyin put it. Quote, when God sank into empirical existence, he was deprived of a harmonious unity, logical reason, and organized purpose, end quote. For Ilyin, our world, a world of facts and passion, is senseless. Ilyin found it immoral that a fact might be grasped in a historical setting. Quote, that the world of empirical existence cannot be theologically justified, end quote. Passions are evil. God erred in his creation by releasing, quote, evil nature of the sensual, end quote. God yielded to a, quote, a romantic, end quote, purpose by making beings, ourselves, who are moved by sex. And so, quote, the romantic content of the world overcomes the rational form of thought, and the thought cedes its place to unthinking purposes, end quote. Physical love. God left us amidst spiritual and moral relativism. By condemning God, Ilyin empowered philosophy, or at least one philosopher himself. He preserved the vision of a divine totality that existed before the creation of the world, but left it to himself to reveal how it might be regained. He removed God from the scene. Ilyin himself could issue judgments about what it is and what ought to be. There is a godly world, and it must be somehow redeemed. And this scared work will fall to men who understand their predicament, thanks to Ilyin and his book. The vision was a totalitarian one. We should long for a condition in which we think and feel as one, which means not to think and feel at all. We must cease to exist as individual beings. Quote, evil beings, end quote, Ilyin wrote, quote, where the person begins, end quote, our individuality only provides that the world is flawed. that the empirical fragmentation of human existence incorrect, a transitory, and a metaphysical untrue condition of the world. Ilyin despised the middle class, whose civil society and private life, he thought, kept the world broken and a god at bay. To belong to a layer of society that offered individual social advancement was to be the worst kind of human being. Quote, "This estate constitutes the very lowest level of social existence." End quote. Like all immorality, eternity politics begins by making an exemption for itself. All else in creation might be evil, but because I am myself and my group is mine. Others might be confused and bewitched by the facts and the passions of history, but my nation and myself have maintained a prehistorical innocence, since the only good is this inevitable quality that resides in us, and the only policy is the one that safeguards our innocence, regardless of the costs. Those who accept eternity politics do not expect to live longer, happier, or more faithful lives, or more fruitful lives. They accept suffering as a mark of righteousness if they think that guilty others are suffering more. Life is nasty, brutish, and short. The pleasures of life is that it can be made nastier and more brutish and more shorter for others. Ilya made an exception for Russia and for Russians. The Russian innocence, he proclaimed, was not observed in the world. It was Ilyan's act of faith directed at his own people. Salvation required seeing Russia as it was not. Since the facts of the world are just the corrupt detritus of God's failed creation, true seeing was the contemplation of the invisible. Cornelio Codrulo, the founder of the kindred Roman fascism, saw the Archangel Michael in prison and recorded his vision in a few lines. Although Ilyin dressed up the idea of contemplation in several books, it really was no more than that. He saw his own nation as righteous, and the purity of the vision was more important than anything Russia actually did. The nation, quote, "pure and objective," end quote, was what the philosopher saw when he blinded himself. Innocence took a specific biological form. What Ilyin saw was a virginal Roman body. Like fascists and other authoritarians of the day, Ilyin insisted that his nation was a creation, quote, "an organism of nature and the soul," end quote, "an animal in Eden without original sin." Who belonged within the Russian organism was not for the individual to decide, since cells do not decide whether they belong to the body. Russian culture, Ilyin wrote, automatically brought, quote, "fraternal union," end quote, wherever Russian power extended. Ilyin wrote of Ukrainians in quotation marks because he denied their separate existence beyond the Russian organism. To speak of Ukraine was to be a mortal enemy of Russia. Ilyin took for granted that a post-Soviet Russia would include Ukraine. Ilyin thought that Soviet power concentrated all of the satanic energies of the fractionality and passion in one place, and yet he argued that the triumph of communism showed that Russia was more rather than less innocent. Communism, he maintained, was a seduction by foreigners and desecrated Russians who Ilyin called Tarzans. They lusted to violate immaculate Russian precisely because it was guideless and defenseless. In 1917, Russians had simply been too good to resist the cargo of sin arriving from the West. Despite the depredation of the Soviet leaders, Russia's retained a imperceptible goodness, unlike Europeans and Americans, which accepted facts and passion as life. Russia maintained an underlying, quote, "spirit," end quote, that recalled God's totality. Quote, "The nation is not God," end quote, wrote Ilyin, "but the strength of its soul is from God." When God created the world, Russia had somehow escaped history and remained in eternity. Ilyin's homeland, he thought, was therefore free from the forward flow of time and the accumulation of accident and the choice that he had found so intolerable. Russia instead experienced repeated cycles of threat and defense. Everything that happened must have been an attack from the outside world on Russian innocence, or a justified Russian response to such a threat. In such a scheme, it was very easy for Ilyin, who knew little of the actual Russian history, to grasp centuries in simple phrases. What a historian might see as the spread of a power from Moscow across northern Asia and half of Europe was for Ilyin nothing more than a self-defense. According to Ilyin, every single battle ever fought by Russia was defensive. Russia was always the victim of a continual blockade by Europe. As Ilyin saw matters, quote, "the Russian nation, since its full conversion to Christianity, had counted nearly 1,000 years of historical suffering," end quote. Russia does no wrong. Wrong can only be done to Russia. Facts do not matter, and responsibility vanishes. Before the Bolshevik Revolution, Ilyin was a law student and a believer in progress. After 1917, everything seemed possible and all permitted. Lawlessness from the far left, Ilyin thought, would have to be exceeded by a still greater lawlessness from the far right. In his mature work, Ilyin thus portrayed Russia's lawlessness as a patriotic virtue. Quote, "The fact of the matter," end quote, he wrote, "is, quote, that fascism is a redemptive excess of patriotic arbitrariness," end quote. The Russian word, "prozvol," arbitrariness, has always been the better nor Russian reformers. In portraying Ryazov as patriotic, Ilyin was turning against the legal reform and announcing that politics must instead follow the caprice of a single ruler. Ilyin's use of the word for redemptive, spasitlani, released a profound religious meaning into politics. Like other fascists, such as Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf, he turned Christian ideas of sacrifice and redemption towards a new purpose. Hitler claimed that he would redeem the world for a distant god by ridding it of Jews. Quote, "So I believe that I am acting as the Almighty Creator would want," end quote, wrote Hitler. Quote, "insofar as restraining the Jew, I'm doing the work of the Lord," end quote. The Russian word spasitlani would usually be applied by an Orthodox Christian to the deliverance of believers by Christ's sacrifice on Calvary. What Ilyin meant was Russia needed a redeemer who would make the cavalice sacrifice of shedding the blood of others to take power. A fascist coup was an act of salvation, the first steps towards the return of totality to the universe. The man who would redeem God's flawed world would had to ignore what God said about love. Jesus instructed his disciples that, after loving God, the most important law was to love one's neighbour. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus refers to Leviticus 19:34. Quote, "And if a stranger sojourn with thee in your land, ye shall not vex him, but the stranger that dwelleth with you shall be upon you as one born among you, and thou shalt love him as thyself. And ye were a stranger in the land of Egypt, I am the Lord your God." For Ilyin, there were no neighbours. Individuality was corrupt and transient, and among the only meaningful connections in the lost divine totality. So long as the world is fractured, loving God means a constant struggle, quote, "against the enemies of the divine order on the earth," end quote. To do anything but to join this was to enact evil. Quote, "He who opposes the cavalrous struggle against the devil is himself the devil," end quote. Faith meant war. Quote, "May your prayers be a sword and your sword be a prayer," end quote. Because the world was sinful and God was absent, his companion must emerge from some uncorrupt realm beyond history. Quote, "power," end quote, Ilyin imagined, quote, "comes as by itself to the strong man," end quote. A man would appear from nowhere, and Russia would recognize their redeemer. We will accept our freedom and our laws from Russian patriot who leads Russia to salvation. Emerging from fiction, the Redeemer disregards the facts of the world and creates a myth around himself. By taking on the burden of Russia's passions, he channels, quote, "the evil nature of the sensuality," end quote, into a grand unity. The leader will be, quote, "sufficiently manly," end quote, like Mussolini. He hardens himself in just and manly services. He is inspired by a spirit of totality rather than by a particular personal or party motivation. He stands alone and goes alone because he sees the future of politics and knows what must be done, end quote. Russia will kneel before him, living organ of Russia, the instrument of self-redemption. The Redeemer suppresses factuality, directs passions, and generates myth by ordering a violent attack against his chosen enemies. A fascist scorned by any politics rooted in society, its preference, its interests, its virtues of future, the right of its members, and so on. Fascism begins not with an assessment of what is within, but from a rejection of what is without. The outside world is a literary source material for an enemy image composed by a dictator. Following the Nazi legal theorist Carl Schmitt, Ilyin defined politics as the art of identifying and neutralizing the enemy. Ilyin thus began his article, quote, "on Russian nationalism," end quote, with the simple claim that national Russia has enemies. The flawed world had to oppose Russia because Russia was the only source of divine totality. The Redeemer had the obligation to make war and the right to choose which one. Ilyin believes that war was justified when, quote, "the spiritual attainment of the nation are threatened," end quote, which they always will be until individuality is brought to an end. To make war against the enemies of God was to express innocence. Making war, not love, was the proper release of passion, because it did not endanger but protected the virginality of the national body. In the 1930s, the Romanian fascists sang of an ironclad breast of lily-white souls. Guiding others to bloodshed, Russia's Redeemer would draw all the Russian sexual energy to himself and guide its release. War was the only excess that Ilyin endorsed, a mythical communion of virginal organism and otherworldly Redeemer. True, quote, passion, end quote, was fascist violence, the rising sword that was also a kneeling prayer. Quote, "everything begins in mythical and ends in politics," end quote, as the poet Charles Péguy reminds us. Ilyin thought began with a contemplation of God, sex, and truth in 1916, and ends a century later as the orthodoxy of the Kremlin and justification for wars against Ukraine, the European Union, and the United States. Destruction is always easier than creation. Ilyin found it difficult to specify the institutional form a redeemed Russia would take, and his unsolved problem haunted Russia's leaders today. The chief of these is the durability of Russian state. Legal institutions that permit the succession of power allowed citizens to envision a future where leaders change, but states remain. Fascism, however, is about a sacred and eternal connection between the Redeemer and his people. A fascist presents institutions and laws as corrupt barriers between the leader and the folk that must be circumvented or destroyed. Ilyin tried to design a Russian political system, but in his sketches could never get beyond this conundrum. He attempted to solve the problem semantically by treating the personality of the Redeemer as an institution. The Redeemer should be regarded as a leader, Gosudar, quote, head of state, end quote, democratic dictator, end quote, and a, quote, national dictator, end quote, an assemblage of titles that record the fascist leaders of the 1920s and the 1930s. The Redeemer would be responsible for all executive, legislative, and judicial functions, and command the armed forces. Russia would be a centralized state with no federal units. Russia should not be a one-party state, as fascist regimes in the 1930s had been. That was a one-party too many. Russia should be a zero-party state, redeemed by a man. Parties shouldn't exist, according to Ilyin, only to help ritualize elections. Allowing Russians to vote in free elections, thought Ilyin, was like allowing an embryo to choose their species. Voting with a secret ballot allowed citizens to think of themselves as individuals and thereby confirm the evil character of the world. Quote, the principle of democracy is the irresponsible human atom, end quote, and the individuality must be overcome by political habits that excite and sustain Russians' collective love for their Redeemer. Thus, quote, we must reject the mechanisms and arithmetical understanding of politics, end quote, as well as, quote, blind faith in the number of votes and political significance, end quote. Voting should unite the nation in a gesture of subjugation. Elections should be public and ballots signed. Ilyin imagined a society as a cooperative structure, where every person and every group would hold a defined place. There would be no distinction between the state and the population, but rather organic spiritual unity of the government with the people, and the people with the government. The Redeemer would stand alone at the height, and the middle classes would lie crushed at the bottom under the weight of everyone else. In normal parlance, middle classes are in the middle because people rise and fall through them. Placing the middle classes at the bottom was to assert the righteousness of inequality. Social mobility was excluded from the outset. An idea that Ilyin intended as fascist thus permitted the justified oligarchy, ruled by wealthy few, as in Russia in the 2010s. If the purpose of the state is to preserve the wealth of the Redeemer and his friends, then the rule of law is impossible. Without the rule of law, it is difficult to earn money that will allow for better lives. Without social advancement, no story of the future seems plausible. The weakness of a state policy is then recast as the mythical connection of a leader with his people. Rather than governing, the leader produces crises and spectacles. Law ceases to signify neutral norms that allow for social advancement, and comes to mean subordinates to a status quo, right to watch, the duty to be entertained. Ilyin used the words, quote, law, end quote, but he did not endorse the rule of law. By law, he meant the relationship between the caprice of the Redeemer and the obedience of everyone else, against a fascist idea provided to be convenient for an emerging oligarchy. The loving duty of the Russian masses was to translate the Redeemer's every whim into a sense of legal obligation on their part. The obligations, of course, was not reciprocal. Russians had a special arrangement of the soul that allowed them to suppress their own reason and accept, quote, the law in our hearts, end quote. By this, Ilyin understood that suppression of individual reason in favor of national submission. With the Redeemer in command of such a system, Russia would exhibit the metaphysical identity of all people of the same nation. The Russian nation, summoned to instant war against a spiritual threat, was a creature rendered divine by its submission to an arbitrary leader whom emerged from fiction. The Redeemer would take upon himself the burden of dissolving all facts and passions, rendering senseless any aspiration of any individual Russian to see or feel or change the world. Each Russian's place in the cooperating structure would be fixed like a cell in a body. Each Russian would experience this immobility as freedom. Unified by their Redeemer, their sins washed away in the blood of others, Russians would welcome God back to his creation. Christian fascist totalitarianism is an invitation to God to return to the world and help Russia bring an end to history everywhere. Ilyin placed a human being in the role of the true Christ, required to break the law of love in the name of God. In doing so, he blurred the lines between what is human and what is not, between what is possible and what is not. The fantasy of an eternal innocence of Russia includes the fantasy of an eternal innocent Redeemer, who does no wrong and therefore will not die. Ilyin could not answer the question of who might succeed the Redeemer, since doing so would make the Redeemer a human subject to aging and death, no less part of the thought universe than the rest of us. Ilyin had no earthly idea, in other words, of how a Russian state could endure. The very dread of what comes next generates a sense of threat that could be projected upon others as foreign policy. Totalitarianism is its own true enemy. That is the secret it keeps from itself by attacking others. In the 2010s, Ilyin's ideas served post-Soviet billionaires, and post-Soviet billionaires served them. Putin and his friends and allies accumulated vast wealth beyond the law, and then remade the state to preserve their own gains. Having achieved this, Russian leaders had to define politics as being rather than doing. An ideology such as Ilyin's purports to explain why certain men have wealth and power in terms other than greed and ambition. What robber would not prefer to be called a redeemer? To men raised in the Soviet Union in the 1970s, Ilyin's ideas were comfortable for a second reason. To the Russian kleptocrats of that generation, the men in power in the 2010s, his entire style of thinking was familiar. Although Ilyin opposed Soviet power, the shape of his arguments were eerily similar to those of Marxism, Leninism, and Stalinism, in which all Soviet citizens were educated. Although the Russian kleptocrats, by no means philosophers, the instructions of their youth led them surprisingly close to the justifications. Ilyin and the Marxism he opposed shared a philosophical origin and language. That was Hegelianism. G.W.F. Hegel's ambition was to solve the difference between what is and what should be. His claim was that something called spirit, a unity of thought and minds, was emerging over time, through the conflicts that defined epochs. Hegel's was an appealing way of seeing our fractious world, since it suggested that catastrophe was an indication of progress. History was a slaughter bench. The bloodshed had a purpose. This idea allowed philosophers to propose as prophets, seers of hidden patterns that would resolve themselves into a better world, judges of whom had to suffer now so that all would benefit later. If spirit was the only good, then any means that history chose for its realizations was also good. Karl Marx was critical of Hegel's idea of spirit. He and others left Hegel's claimed that Hegel had smuggled God into his system under the heading of spirit. The absolute good, suggested Marx, was not God, but humanity's lost essence. History was a struggle, but its sense was a man's overcoming of circumstances to regain his own nature. The emergence of technology, argued Marx, allowed one man to dominate others, forming social classes. Under capitalism, the bourgeoisie controlled the means of production, oppressing the mass of workers. This very oppression instructed workers about the character of history and made them revolutionaries. The proletariat would overthrow the bourgeoisie, seizing the means of production and thereby restoring man to himself. Once there was no property, thought Marx, human beings would live in happy cooperation. Ilyin was a right Hegelian. In a typical sharp phrase, he wrote that Marx never got out of the waiting room of Hegelian philosophy. Ilyin, nevertheless, agreed that by spirit, Hegel meant God. Like Marx, Ilyin thought that history had begun with an original sin that doomed humanity to suffer. It was perpetrated not by man upon the man through property, as Marx had thought, but by God upon man through the creation of the world. Rather than killing God, as Hegel's had done, Ilyin left him wounded and lonely. Life was poor and chaotic, as Marx had thought, but not because of the technological or class conflict. People suffered because God's creation was irresolvably conflictual. Facts and passions could not be aligned through revolutions, only through redemption. The only totality was God's, which a chosen nation would restore thanks to a miracle performed by a redeemer. Vladimir Lenin, 1870 to 1924, was the most important Marxist, since he led a revolution in the name of the philosophy. As an activist of a small and illegal party in the Russian Empire, Lenin believed that a disciplined elite had the right to push history forward. If the only good in the world was the restoration of man to his essence, then it was reasonable for those who understood the process to hasten it. This reasoning enabled the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. The Soviet Union was ruled by a small group of people who claimed legitimacy from the specific politics of inevitability. Lenin and Ilyin did not know each other, but were uncannily close. Lenin's patronymic Ilyinik, and Ilyin as a pen name. The real Ilyin read and reviewed some of the work. When Ilyin was arrested, Bolshevik secret police, the Chechia, Lenin intervened on his behalf in order to express his admiration of Ilyin's philosophy. Ilyin despised Lenin's revolution, but he endorsed his violence and voluntarism. Like Lenin, he thought that Russia needed a philosophical elite himself to define ends and means. Like the Marxist socialist utopia, Ilyin's divine totality required violent revolution, or rather, violent counter-revolution. Other Russian philosophers saw resemblance. Nikolai Berdyaev found in Ilyin's work the nightmare of evil good. Reviewing a book that Ilyin published in 1925, Berdyaev wrote that a Czechia in the name of God is more horrifying than a Czechia in the name of the devil. His judgment was prophetical. Quote, the Bolsheviks would have no fundamental problem except in Ivan Ilyin's book. They consider themselves the bearers of the absolute good and the opposers of those whom they regard as evil with force. Quote, end quote. Ilyin aged in Germany and Switzerland. As Ilyin aged in Germany and Switzerland, his position tracked those of Lenin's successors. After Lenin died in 1924, Joseph Stalin consolidated power. Ilyin shared Stalinist judgments about the contagious perversity of the Western culture down to the smallest detail. He believed, for instance, that jazz was a deliberate plot to reduce European listeners to mindless dancers incapable of normal sexual intercourse. The Communist Party newsletter Pravda offered a striking similar description of the experience of listening to African American music. Quote, some censures must be conducting with his gigantic phallus. End quote. Though Ilyin wrote books chronicling terror under Stalin, his attitude to the law was essentially similar to that of his perpetrators. Andrei Vyazhevsky, a notorious prosecutor at the show trials, believed that, quote, formal law is subordinate to law of the revolution, end quote. This was precisely Ilyin's attitude with respect to his planned counter-revolution. Although Ilyin had initially hoped that the Second World War would destroy the Stalin Soviet Union, in its aftermath he presented Russia as Stalin did. Stalin called the USSR the homeland of socialism. If the Soviet Union were destroyed, when his argument, communism would have no future, and humanity's only hope would be lost. Thus, any action to defend the Soviet Union was justified. Ilyin saw Russia as a homeland of God to be preserved at all costs, since it was the only territory from which divine totality could be restored. After the war, Stalin gave priority to the Russian nation, as opposed to Ukraine, Belarus, Central Asia, the Caucasus, and dozens of people of the Soviet Union. Russia, Stalin claimed, had saved the world from fascism. Ilyin's view was that Russia would save the world not from, but with fascism. In both cases, the only receptacle of absolute good was Russia, and the permanent enemy was the decadent West. Soviet communism was a politics of inevitability that yielded to a politics of eternity. Over the decades, the idea of a Russia as a beacon of the world gave way to the image of Russia as a victim of mindless hostility. In the beginning, Bolshevism was not a state, but a revolution. The hope around the world would follow the Russian example. Then it was a state with a task: to build a socialism by imitating capitalism, then overcoming it. Stalinism was a vision of the future that justified millions of deaths by starvation and another million or so by execution in the 1930s. The Second World War changed the story. Stalin and his supporters and successors all claimed after 1945 that the self-inflicted carnage of the 1930s had been necessary to defeat Germans in the 1940s. If the 1930s were about the 1940s, then they were not about a distant future of socialism. The aftermath of the Second World War was the beginning of the end of the Soviet politics of inevitability, and thus the opening gestures towards the Russian politics of eternity. Stalin's economic policy, forced industrialization funded by collectivized agriculture, created social mobility of 2 generations but not 3. In the 1950s and 60s, Soviet leaders agreed not to kill one another, which removed the dynamic from politics. In the 1970s, Leonid Brezhnev took a logical step towards politics of eternity, portraying the Second World War as an apogee of Soviet history. as the apogee of Soviet history. The Soviet citizens were instructed to look not forwards but backwards, to the triumph of their parents and grandparents in the Second World War. The West was no longer the enemy because it represented a capitalism that would be surpassed. The West was the enemy because the Soviet Union had been invaded from the West in 1941. The Soviet citizens born in the 1960s and 1970s were raised in a cult of the past that defined the West as a perpetual threat. The last decade of Soviet communism prepared Soviet citizens for Ilyin's view of the world. The oligarchy that emerged in the Russian Federation after 1991 had a great deal to do with the centralization of production under communism, the ideas of the Russian economists thereafter, and the greed of the Russian leaders. American conventional wisdom contributed to the disaster by suggesting that the market would create institutions, rather than stressing that the institutions were needed for markets. In the 21st century, it proved easier to blame the West than to take stock of Russian choices. The Russian leaders who did the blaming in the 2010s were the very individuals that stole the national wealth from the heights of the Russian state, were the beneficiaries rather than the victims of the capitalism's career in Russia. The men of Putin's entourage ensured that the rules of law had no chance in Russia, since they themselves created and profited from a state monopoly on corruption. Ilyin's ideas sanctified radical inequalities at home, changed the subject of politics from reform to innocence, while defining the West as a permanent source of spiritual threat. No Russian state could be built on Ilyin's concepts, but they did help robbers to present themselves as redeemers. They did enable new leaders to choose enemies and thus create a fictional problem that could not be solved, such as the permanent hostility of a decadent West. The notion that Europe and America were eternal foes because they envied the pristine Russian culture was pure fiction that generated real policy. The attempt to destroy attainments abroad that Russia's leaders could not manage at home. The politics of eternity could not make Putin or any other man immortal, but it can make other ideas unthinkable. And that is what eternity means. The same thing over and over again. A tedium, exciting to believe because of the illusion that it is particularly theirs. Of course, this sense of us and them, or as fascists prefer, friends and foes, friends and enemies, is the least specific human experience of them all. To live within is to sacrifice individuality. The only thing that stands between inevitability and eternity is history, as considered and lived by individuals. If we grasp eternity and inevitability as ideas within our own history, we might see what has happened to us, what we might do about it. We understand totalitarianism as a threat to institutions, but also to themselves. In the future of their assault, Ilyin's ideas clarified individualism as a political virtue, the one that enables all others. Are we individuals who see that there are many good things and the politics involves responsible considerations and choices rather than visions of totality? Do we see that there are other individuals in the world who might be at work on the same project? Do we understand that we, being an individual, requires constant consideration of endless factuality, a constant selection among many irreducible passions? The virtue of individualism becomes visible in the throes of our moment, but it will abide only if we see history and ourselves within it, and accept our share of responsibility.